Yeah, in this video, we'll talk about the networking options on the app services. So when we create an app service, I'm just giving a name called as an acute HRMS dot Azure websites.net. So it is going to automatically create an FQDN name with the name, whatever we give it. And we can have our own a custom domain, like I can say called as an hrms.acuteland.com. And by default, the Azure will provide some public IP, which will I'm just taking some example as an IP. Okay, it provides a public IP. So when we create any new app service, so by default, the app service is accessible from anywhere. So when I mean by anywhere means over the internet, for the internet. So we don't have any restrictions, that is internet. So any application that is deployed, the application which is deployed inside this app service is accessible from anywhere, which we call it as in public access allowed. Public access allowed. So could be sometimes this could be an advantage, sometimes this could be a disadvantage, but as a default, the behavior of this particular app service is publicly access allowed, and we can use any of these two URLs to access this app service from outside or the application from the outside. So let me create an app service. I'm giving it acute HRMS. I'm selecting a premium. Create. So we have the app service got created. I'm taking the URL. I'm trying to access. So it is accessible. I'm going to a different network. I'm logging into a different machine, which is there in a different network. I'm trying to access this particular application. Just default, by this application is accessible from anywhere. Now, when we go to the apps under the settings, we see called as a networking. So as we would see here, public network access enabled with no restrictions. So by default, this particular app service is accessed from anywhere or allowed from anywhere. So click on this one. We see enabled from selected virtual networks and IP addresses. So when we go to an option called as an selected virtual networks and IP addresses. So it provides an option called as a selected virtual networks and IP addresses. Now this app service can be connected to an Azure Virtual Network. Let's say you have an Azure Virtual Network, and we can connect this Azure App Service to an Azure Virtual Network, which can be accessible from the only from the Azure Virtual Network or IP addresses. Now, this feature allows us to access from internet allowed IP addresses. So we can specify that I don't want this app service to be accessed from anywhere around the world, but I want to access this from the specific IP network and also from the access from the Azure Virtual Network, Azure Virtual Network. Now let's say there are some resources like virtual machines sitting in this virtual network or users connected in this particular virtual network using the Azure virtual desktops or anything, they can access this particular application. Now, what is the advantage of this is by using this particular feature, we can define that from which particular IP addresses this application is accessible and from which Azure virtual networks. If there are multiple Azure virtual networks existing, you can restrict that this application or app service is accessible only from a specific IP virtual network. So we can go to the app service. I'm selecting enable from select virtual networks and IP addresses. Down I can see add. Name. I'm giving it like an home IP or something. I'm just giving it IP. Allowed. A priority. I'm saying 300. Type. Are you talking about IPv4, IPv6, virtual network, or a service stack? Or service stack. So I'm selecting IPv4. Let me see what is my ipaddress.com. What is my public IP address? So this is my public IP address from where I'm allowing it. So I'm saying that, okay, allow this particular app service from this particular IP address. I'm adding a rule. I'm adding a rule. The default, as we see, called as an is deny last rule. But above that, the 300 priority, we given that from this particular IP address, this app service is allowed. Save the settings. Now, let me go to this particular app service. Let me take the URL of this app service. I'm opening incognito window. I'm typing this app service. It is accessed from here. I'm going to another network where a different machine on a different network. I'm pasting the URL. Now we can see an error message called as an error 403 forbidden. The web app you attempted to reach has blocked your access. So what happened here now? We have allowed this particular app only from a specific IP address. Only from a specific IP address. That is from this IP. So when I go to this machine, when I see what is my ipaddress.com, I see a different IP. Now I can allow this IP. Now as of now, we are getting a forbidden. I can take this public IP. Now I can add one more rule called as an office network 301 IP address and add it. I will save these settings. Now I'm going to a remote network. So earlier we got a message forbidden error. Now we allowed this particular IP address. I'm saying refresh. Yeah. Now I can see that the web app is accessible from the Office network also. I'm removing this particular rule. Select this rule. I'm deleting it. Save it. So now I go to this one. Sometimes we need to give a minute for Microsoft to update these changes. So I removed again this IP address. Now it should give me an error. We can see here error 40403 forbidden. Now second case, access from Azure Virtual Networks. So as of now, I don't have any virtual networks created. So I'm just creating a virtual network. I could VNet. I just want to take the default settings. Now we create a virtual network. I'm going to the app service. Go to the networking options. Enable with access restrictions. Add a rule. Here I can select a virtual network. Subscription. What is the virtual network name? Acute VNet. The subnets which you want to allow. If there are multiple subnets in the VNet, you can select from which subnets you want to allow access. And you can give the priority, whatever the rule. The least, I'm saying acute VNet network. Allow. Add a rule. Save the settings. Now what we are trying to do here now. So we created one virtual network. Now we am saying that allow from a specific public IP address. And apart from that, this particular app service is accessible from this particular virtual network. Now, the users or the applications or the systems which are part of this virtual network can access this app service, and the users or part of the specific public IP address can also access this app service. But it is not publicly opened. It has been restricted to limited networks or limited IP addresses. That's where we would see an option called as in this one. Now disabled it. So when you disable this one, so when we disable this public access or colon, when we say called as a disabled. Now the app service will not be accessible from internet or from virtual network. So, network. So by default, so what happens here is then it is going to completely disable the access. Then what is the need of creating an app service when it is not accessible? We'll come to that later. But when we disable it, public access, now the app will not be accessible from anywhere. So I'm taking the app URL. We can see called as a forbidden error. I'm going to remote network. I'm pasting the URL on a different network. We see called as a 4. Now it is not allowed access from anywhere. So not from internet, not from virtual network. Then what is the point of having the app service? Now I have a requirement that I don't want this app service to be accessible from internet. It should be accessible only from a virtual network or even the private network. So what happens? The accepts, we can create something called as a private endpoint. Maybe you can refer to a networking session. Now, private endpoint is a virtual NIC created and attached to an app service. So which can accept the traffic or request from only virtual networks. So networks. Now this is first one is an completely allowed to the internet. Second one is a mix of both virtual networks and internet. The third one, when we disable a public access, it will not be accessible from the internet, but we have to create a private endpoint in order to accessible from the virtual network. Now, so with that, what happens is that when we create a private endpoint, it creates one virtual NIC card and assigns a private IP. So that this app service is having a public IP. Instead of that, it can also have a private IP where it can listen for the traffic. Now, what happens here now? So it is something like a 10.10.10.11 or something 14. Now the Azure Virtual Networks, which are where the private endpoint is connected, it can start listening the traffic on this particular IP address. Now, when we don't create a private endpoint, even if the user is coming from a virtual network, he'll be going through the public network only. So always the traffic will be accessible from the virtual network over the public IP. Even it is in a virtual network. But when we enable a private endpoint, the app service will start listening on private IP, which has been assigned during the creation of the private endpoint. Now let me create a virtual machine before we into the VNet. So I'm selecting creating this virtual machine in the default subnet of a virtual network. So while the VM is getting created, let me create a one more subnet in the virtual network. I'm creating one more subnet just for testing purpose. I'm saying app service and 1.0. I create a one more subnet. Let's wait for this VM to get created. I have this VM got created. Let me log into this VM. Now I have a VM one created in this virtual network. Created in this virtual network, but having a public IP, but we haven't connected the app service to the virtual network, or private endpoint is not created. So let me log into this virtual machine. Let me take the URL of the app service. Let me open the browser. I'm pasting this URL. Now we can see error 403 forbidden error. Because what is the setting what we did here in the networking? Public access disabled. We have configured in public network access disabled. There is a reason why we are not able to basically access it from anywhere. So from here, I'm getting this. A virtual machine which I created in Azure Virtual Network also, I'm not able to access the app service. Let me go to the command prompt and say ping. Now we would see 20.116.42.0. So it is resolving to a public IP address, and it start listening the requests or a traffic on this public IP. Now let's go to the private endpoint. So we see on the networking, in the app service, we would see a private endpoint. So if you click on this private endpoints, as of now, we see there are no endpoints created. I create an endpoint. I'm giving it -PA. We can give any name, but easily. So under which virtual network you want to connect to this one. Now what happened here now? For this particular app service, I'm creating a virtual NIC. A virtual NIC. And attaching this virtual NIC, connecting this virtual network to one of the subnets within this virtual network so that it gets a private IP. Select the subnet, app service subnet, say OK. Now the Azure will create a virtual NIC and attach that virtual NIC to this app service and connect to the virtual network, and it gets a private IP address. And automatically DNS record will be created pointing to the private IP address from the virtual network. Now, as of now here, we are seeing that it is getting a public IP. Now let's see after once the private endpoint is created, what is the changes which is going to happen. Now we would see there is a private endpoint got created. Now click on this private endpoint. When I go to the DNS configurations, we would see that it got a private IP address 10.0.1.4. So from an external network outside of this virtual network, still this app service will resolve to a public IP. So I'm trying to communicate from a public network. I'm trying to ping an Azure. So still it is pointing to public IP. But when I go to this virtual network and when I try to ping this app service, it got a private IP address. So it will start reaching to the private IP. So let me go to the machine which is there in the private network. Now let me ping it. Now we would see here, earlier it was resolving to a public IP 20.116.4.0. Now it is resolving to a 10.0.1.4. Now this app service got a private endpoint connected to a virtual network with an IP address called as a 10. Now I'm trying to access this URL. Now I can see that I'm able to access the Azure App Service from a machine which is there in the Azure Virtual Network. But when I come out from the virtual network and I try to access this machine app service, we would see code doesn't fall. Now, what is the advantage of this? We are able to restrict the Azure App Service to be accessible only from the virtual network, not from the external or public networks or anywhere. So we're completely disabling the access from the internet, and by creating a private endpoint, we are enabling access to the app service from the private network, that is from the Azure Virtual Network and our internal network. That is the advantage of using a private endpoint with the public access disabled. That's how you can enable your app services to be accessible only from your corporate networks or anything. So in the next video, we'll talk about VNet integration.